Call came at midnight. One target, one window. 1.5 miles of mountain air, standing between an American team and a body count. Every shooter they trusted had already said it couldn't be done. So they made a call nobody wanted to make and sent for a staff sergeant from Fort Carson that most of the men in that room had never heard of. She walked into Redstone Forward Base, carrying her father's rifle and a silence that made grown operators uncomfortable. By morning, they'd understand why. If you've never seen a legend walk into a room before anyone realizes it, you're about to. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't move. This is just the beginning. The encrypted message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Staff Sergeant Mara Calloway almost didn't hear it. She was sitting at the edge of her bunk at Fort Carson, boots still laced, cleaning the action on her father's rifle with the kind of focused quiet that most people reserved for prayer. The barracks around her were dark. 2 bunks over, Specialist Dawes was snoring in irregular bursts. Outside, Colorado wind pushed against the windows in low, persistent gusts. The alert tone from her secure phone cut through everything. She read the message twice. Set the phone face down on the mattress. Looked at the rifle in her hands, the worn walnut stock, the hairline crack near the grip that had been there since, before she was born, the initials her father had stamped into the metal just above the trigger guard. R.C. Robert Calloway, dead 6 years, still present in every room she entered, carrying his weapon. She read the message a 3rd time. Then she began to pack. 4 hours and 20 minutes later, a blacked-out military transport lifted off from Peterson Space Force Base and banked hard south-southwest into the dark. Mara sat alone in the cargo bay, the rifle case secured between her boots, a half-eaten energy bar in her left hand, a mission overview printed on 2 sheets of paper balanced on her knee. The overview was sparse. That was intentional. Whoever had compiled it hadn't wanted to give her too much before the briefing. What she had was this: a forward operating base called Iron Ridge, located in a remote stretch of eastern Afghanistan that most maps didn't bother naming precisely. Task force designation she didn't recognize. A target described only as HVI-7, high-value individual, 7th on the theater priority list. And a grid coordinate that, when she triangulated against the elevation lines she'd memorized during her last deployment, put the engagement distance somewhere between 22 and 2,400 meters. She folded the papers, finished the energy bar, stared at the ceiling of the cargo bay. 2,400 meters. The world record for a confirmed combat sniper kill sat at just over 3,400 meters, set by a Canadian operator in 2017. She knew that figure the way other people knew their own birthday. 2,400 meters was not outside the theoretical envelope of her rifle, her ammunition, or her training. But theoretical envelopes and live combat were 2 different animals entirely, and anyone who told you otherwise had never lain in a mountain valley with their crosshairs on a human being and the wind changing every 45 seconds. She didn't sleep on the flight. She rarely did before a job. Iron Ridge Forward Operating Base occupied a carved-out shelf of rock and compacted earth at 8,200 feet elevation, surrounded on 3 sides by ridgelines that turned the whole position into a natural funnel for wind. Mara stepped off the transport, at first light into air, so cold it bit through her jacket immediately. An Air Force Master Sergeant with a clipboard and no visible patience met her at the pad. Calloway? That's me. He looked at the rifle case, then at her rank insignia, then at the case, again, as though he was waiting for someone else to step out of the aircraft behind her. Commands waiting. Follow me. She followed him across the base, past a row of vehicles with the mud of 3 different provinces, still caked in their wheel wells, past a comms tent humming with low radio traffic, past a cluster of men in unmarked gear who watched her without expression as she passed. She didn't look at them directly. She cataloged them in her peripheral vision the same way she cataloged terrain, not staring, just absorbing. Command building was a prefab structure bolted to the rock with reinforced anchors, every exterior surface covered in scrim netting. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. A single long table dominated the main room. Maps covered every available wall surface, topographic overlays, satellite imagery, hand-drawn annotations in 3 different ink colors. There were 8 men in the room. Navy seats she identified immediately. Not from the patches, there were no patches, but from the way they occupied space. Trolled, economical, watching her, the way trained predators watched anything unfamiliar entering their territory. Not hostile, just assessing. At the head of the table stood Admiral Grant Holloway. She recognized him from service photographs. Late 50s, hard jaw, the kind of face that had been weathered by both altitude and authority until there wasn't much softness left in it. 2 silver stars, a bronze star with valor. 31 years of service, the last 12 spent in special operations. He was not a man who wasted words, and he was not a man who was accustomed to being surprised. He was looking at her the way he might look at paperwork that had been filed incorrectly. Staff Sergeant Calloway. His voice was flat, not unfriendly. Just precise, sir. I requested a precision shooter from SOCOM through Theater Command. He paused. They sent me an Army staff sergeant. The room was quiet. Not uncomfortably, so these were operators. They understood silence, but the quality of it had weight. Mara set her rifle case down against the wall. That's what they had available, sir. That's not what I was told I'd be getting. I can't speak to what you were told, sir. I can speak to what I can do. Holloway studied her for a moment. Then he turned to the map behind him without further comment on the subject, which told her more than a response would have. He wasn't convinced, but he was going to give her the briefing before he made his decision, which meant he wasn't completely closed either. She'd work with that. HVI 7, he said, tapping the map. Real name is Yusuf Karimi, 43 years old, former Pakistani military, cross-trained with insurgent factions in the late 90s and early 2000s. He's been operating out of this mountain complex. He indicated a satellite image pinned to the wall, a stone compound built into the side of a ridgeline, like it had grown there for approximately 14 months. We've had 3 interdiction attempts. All failed. Direct assault is not viable. The approach terrain is mined. The outer wall has overlapping fields of fire. And our intelligence suggests he has between 30 and 40 armed personnel on site at any given time. One of the SEALs, a senior chief, judging by the way the others gave him a half step of spokes from the right side of the table. We'd crack it eventually. But we'd lose people doing it. How many? Mara asked. The senior chief looked at her evenly. More than 0. Holloway turned back to the map. Karimi has one consistent behavioral pattern. Every morning, at approximately 06:30, he steps onto the eastern balcony of the main compound structure. Security team sweeps it first, but he's there for between 60 and 90 seconds. Our analysts believe it's a prayer ritual. He faces east. Mara moved closer to the satellite imagery. She studied the compound's position on the ridgeline, traced the valley below it with her eyes, found the rough elevation of potential shooting positions on the opposing slope. What's the distance to the eastern balcony from the nearest viable hide position? 2,200 meters at the closest point, Holloway said. 2,400 at positions with better concealment. Wind patterns in the valley? Variable. Our Met team has been running readings for 6 days. Morning thermals off the south slope, crossing winds from a gap in the ridgeline approximately 600 meters to the north. Not consistent. Mara straightened up. What have your shooters said? Holloway's jaw moved slightly. 3 assessments. All 3 rated the shot as beyond practical engagement distance, given the wind variables and the time window. Who were they? That's not your concern, Sergeant. She let that land and move on. What's my concern then? Whether you can make the shot. The room was watching her. She could feel it, all of it, the weight of 8 pairs of trained eyes, the specific quality of attention that men gave to someone they were waiting to see fail. She'd felt it before. In training, when she was the only woman in an advanced marksmanship course and the instructors had graded her work with a microscope, while the others got a magnifying glass. In her first deployment, when her team leader had given her the secondary position for the first 3 months before a single shot she fired on a hillside outside Kandahar had changed his mind permanently. She'd spent a significant portion of her career being the thing people needed to be proven wrong about. Show me the full meteorological data from the past 6 days, too, she said. And I need topographic maps with elevation gradients marked to 10-meter intervals. The satellite imagery you have, all of it, not just the compound, the whole valley floor and both ridge lines. And I want to know what ammunition your previous shooters were running. Holloway looked at her. Sir, she added. He turned to one of the men at the table. Get her what she's asking for. She spent the next 3 hours at the table alone, or nearly alone. The SEALs cycled in and out on their own business. One of them, a younger operator with a scar along his left forearm, lingered for a while, watching her work the topographic maps. She didn't acknowledge him until he spoke. What are you looking for? Microterrain features, she said, without looking up. Anything that creates a predictable wind shadow or channel. Valley winds are chaotic in the aggregate, but they usually have consistent behavior around specific physical features. Rock formations, ravine cuts, tree lines. Our MET team has 6 days of readings. MET readings give me averages. I need patterns. She circled a feature on the topo map, a rock outcropping near the valley floor, approximately 400 meters from the base of the opposing ridge line. This formation. What's it look like at ground level? He leaned over and looked. Never been down there. That's the valley floor. Open ground. The gap in the ridgeline your admiral mentioned, it's here. She tapped the map. Wind comes through from the northwest. This outcropping would create a deflection. Depending on the morning thermals from the south slope, you'd get a predictable mixing zone somewhere between here and here. She indicated a corridor, which means if I'm in this position, she moved her finger to a point on the opposing ridgeline, and I account for the deflection. The wind is actually more manageable than your MET data suggests. The SEAL was quiet for a moment. You figured that out from a topo map? My father taught me to read terrain before he taught me to read a scope. She finally looked up. Who are you? Petty Officer First Class Reyes. I'm on the assault element. What's your timeline if this works? We have a pair of Little Bird stage 12 clicks out. Once the target is confirmed down, we go in fast. 30-minute flight, then we breach and clear. The confusion on their end buys us the window. And if it doesn't work? Reyes's expression didn't change. Then we probably go home and tell command we need a different plan. What about Karimi if he walks off that balcony alive tomorrow morning? He disappears back into the compound, and we start the clock over. Intel says he's been aware of the interdiction attempts. He won't give us another window like this for months, maybe longer. Mara turned back to the map. Then it needs to work. She was studying the meteorological logs for the 4th time when the door opened, and a man walked in who changed the temperature of the room without saying a word. He was in his mid-60s at least, maybe older, wearing civilian clothes that had the specific rumpled quality of someone who'd spent decades in uniform and never fully shed the posture, even after the uniform was gone. Lean, straight-backed, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of hands that had spent serious time behind a weapon. He moved with deliberate economy, nothing wasted. He saw the rifle case against the wall before he saw her. She watched him cross the room in 6 steps, crouch down beside the case, and look at the exterior without touching it. He was reading the wear patterns, she realized, the specific distribution of scratches and dings and faded finish that a rifle accumulated over years of field use. He was reading it like a story. Then he straightened and looked at her directly for the first time. "Where did you get this case?" "It came with the rifle," Mara said. "Can I see the rifle?" She considered him for a moment. "Who are you?" "Elias Voss, retired Colonel, Marine Corps. I'm here as a spotter consultant." His voice was measured and unhurried, the kind of voice that had given orders in enough serious situations that it no longer needed to perform authority. "The rifle in that case, may I see it?" She unlatched the case and opened it. The rifle lay on its custom foam bed, the way it always did, barrel pointing left, action exposed, the walnut stock dark with age and oil and decades of handling. The engraving on the receiver plate was small but legible. RC on the left side. On the right, a small additional marking that most people never noticed, a single horizontal line with two short vertical marks, a notation system her father had used to track certain weapons. Voss leaned over the case, and she saw him read the receiver marking. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Robert Calloway's rifle," he said. It wasn't a question. The room had acquired an audience without her noticing. Two of the SEALs had drifted closer. Reyes was back. Even Holloway had appeared in the doorway from the side office. "He was my father," Mara said. Voss looked at her. Really looked at her not in the way the others had been looking at her, cataloging rank and gender and apparent experience, but in the way someone looked at a thing they needed to understand before they could proceed. "I served with Robert Calloway in 2003, Voss said. "Helmand Province. He was attached to our unit as a liaison from the Marine Scout Sniper program." He paused. "I never saw another shooter like him. I've been doing this work for 40 years. The room was very quiet. "I've heard the stories," Mara said. "The shot outside Sanjin?" Voss said. Did he ever tell you about it?" "He told me about a shot. He didn't give me details until I was old enough to understand what they meant. 1,900 meters, strong crosswind. He was shooting iron sights because his scope had taken a round in a firefight 2 days earlier." Voss shook his head slowly. "I was his spotter. I watched it happen, and I still don't entirely believe it." "He told me that story a different way," Mara said. "He said he almost missed." Voss's expression shifted something between surprise and recognition. "That's exactly right. He adjusted at the last second for a gust I hadn't called. If he'd held the original solution, the bullet would have passed 1.5 feet wide. He said the lesson was that the data is always incomplete. You account for what you know, then you account for what you don't." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Holloway, who was still standing in the doorway. "Admiral," Voss said, "I'll spot for Sergeant Calloway." Holloway looked at Mara. His expression hadn't softened exactly, but something in it had shifted the specific quality of skepticism that said, "I don't know yet," rather than "I've already decided." "My 3 previous assessments said the shot wasn't viable," Holloway said. "Your 3 previous assessments didn't have the right shooter," Voss said. He said it the way he would have said that the sky was a particular color, not arrogantly, just as a statement of observed fact. Holloway let the silence sit for several seconds. Nobody in the room moved. "Get them whatever they need," he finally said to the senior chief. "Full meteorological support, updated intel package, access to the observation post on the North Ridge Line." He looked at Mara. "You get 1 shot at the Hyde establishment tonight. First light. 500, you need to be in position. The window opens at 0630. "Understood," Mara said. Holloway turned to leave. Then he stopped, and for the first time, he addressed her without the specific quality of assessment. In his voice, it was closer to something that might have been respect, or at least its immediate precursor. "Your father was a legend in the sniper community," he said. "I never met him personally, but I know the name." He paused. "I hope you're everything that name implies, Sergeant." He walked out. The senior chief exhaled quietly and went back to his workstation. The other SEALs dispersed. Reyes caught her eye and gave her a single nod before he left. Voss remained beside the rifle case, looking at the weapon. "We have a lot of preparation to do," Mara said. "We do." He straightened. "But first tell me about his training. Not the official record. What he actually taught you." Mara looked at her father's rifle. The worn walnut. The initials in the metal. The weight of everything it carried. "We should get to work," she said. "This is work," Voss said quietly. "The most important kind." She considered that. "He started teaching me when I was 9, she said. "Not the shooting, the waiting. He said most shooters fail because they never learn how to be patient without going somewhere else in their head. He'd take me out to the back 40 of our property in Wyoming, set me in a prone position behind a spot scope, and have me call wind flags for 4 hours without a break." She paused. He said if I could read wind before I could read the scope, I'd already beaten half the people I'd compete against. Voss was listening with the specific attention of someone who recognized a teaching lineage. "And the other half?" he asked. He said, "The other half you beat by doing the work when nobody is watching." She looked at Voss directly. "He talked about you sometimes. Not by name until I was older. But there was a spotter," he mentioned someone who could read terrain from a map the way other people read weather. He said that man taught him things about elevation gradients that changed the way he thought about long-range trajectories. Something moved across Voss's face that he didn't bother to hide. Robert said that. He wasn't generous with credit, Mara said. So when he gave it, he meant it. Voss looked at the rifle one more time. Then he put his hand briefly on the edge of the case, not touching the weapon. Just the case, and straightened up. "Let's get to work," he said. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Mara converted the meteorological data into layered wind models using a method her father had developed, and Voss immediately recognized not because it matched any standard protocol, but because it matched an approach the two men had developed together in a Helmand compound in 2003, and apparently never formally documented. "Kept this going," Voss said, looking at her annotated maps. "He refined it," Mara said. "He used to say the original version was 40% yours." 60, Voss said. He was being modest. She pushed the maps aside and started on the ammunition assessment. She had brought 4 types of 0.338 Lapua Magnum loads, including a custom hand load she'd developed over 2 years of range work at Fort Carson, a 300-grain projectile over a specific powder charge that she'd tuned to her father's rifle's unique chamber dimensions, which were slightly non-standard due to a replacement barrel fitted in 1998. Explained the load to Voss in detail. He asked 3 precise questions. His questions told her. He knew what he was asking about. 2,200 meters, that load in this rifle. What's your expected deviation in a 10-knot crosswind? He asked. Approximately 16 inches, depending on the crosswind angle. Closer to 11 inches if it's quartering rather than perpendicular. And at 2,400, 22 to 26, depending on consistency. Problem isn't the deviation, it's predicting the deviation. The wind holds a consistent value across the full engagement distance. I can account for it. If it shifts between the muzzle and the target, the calculation gets significantly more complex. "Which it will," Voss said. "Which it will," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father used to say that certainty was a liar." He said that in a lot of contexts. It applies to this one. She loaded 4 rounds into the rifle's magazine, not because she expected to need 4, but because her father had said that false confidence began with walking into a situation thinking you only needed 1. She ran a function check. Everything moved the way it always had, smooth and precisely weighted. The bolt throw requiring exactly the pressure she expected. Outside, the Afghan night had settled over the ridgeline. Somewhere in the darkness to the northeast, Yusuf Karimi was inside his mountain fortress. Planning whatever he planned, unaware that a woman sitting in a prefab command building was looking at maps of his morning routine. 2,200 hours, the senior chief came in with an updated intelligence report. He put it on the table in front of Mara without fanfare. Window confirmed for 0630 local, he said. Drone imagery from 2 hours ago shows the same behavioral pattern. Subject exits the eastern balcony access door, moves to the railing, faces east. Duration consistent with previous observations, 60 to 90 seconds. No variance in entry point, same door every time. Only access to that balcony from the interior. Mara studied the satellite imagery again. The eastern balcony was partially cantilevered over the rock face, visible from the northeast sector of the opposing ridgeline, but screened from direct observation from the valley floor by an overhang above it. It was a calculated position. Karimi wasn't stupid. He'd chosen a spot that felt private, that had cover above and restricted sight lines from most angles. He'd accounted for observation posts and drone surveillance. He hadn't accounted for the specific combination of elevation, position, elevation, and shooting that the northeastern ridgeline provided. Or maybe he had, and he'd decided the distance made it theoretical rather than practical. 3 of your shooters agreed with him, Mara said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. What's that? The senior chief asked. Nothing. She set the imagery down. We move at 0300, 0315. Scout element goes ahead at 0230 to clear the route and confirm the observation post hasn't been compromised. Who's the scout element? Reyes and Torres. They've been up that ridgeline twice in the past week. They know the route. Tell them I need them to note the conditions of the rock surfaces in the last 200 meters of the approach. I need to know if there's frost accumulation, loose surface material, or moisture. It affects how I'm going to position and whether I need to pad the bipod. The senior chief looked at her. I'll pass it along. After he left, Voss poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corner and set one in front of her. Coffee was terrible. Military coffee always was, thin and overbrewed, but it was hot. You should sleep, he said. 2 hours at least. I'm not going to sleep. I know. He sat down across from her. Robert never slept before a job either. He said it was a design flaw in his psychology, and he'd accepted it. I don't think I'd call it a design flaw, Mara said. I think it's the body being honest about the situation. That's a more charitable interpretation. He always said I was more charitable than him. Were you? She considered. About some things. Voss wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving across the netting on the building's exterior. A low, intermittent sound like a held breath being slowly released. There's something you should know, Voss said. About why I agreed to come here. She waited. The previous assessment team, their lead shooter, was a man named Carver. Excellent operator. I've seen him work. He paused. He wasn't wrong about the difficulty. He was right that the shot is at the extreme edge of practical engagement parameters. He wasn't wrong about the wind variables. But, Mara said, there's a difference between a shot being difficult and a shot being impossible. Carver assessed the difficulty correctly and drew the wrong conclusion. Voss looked at her steadily. Your father could have made this shot. I've been in this business long enough to know the number of shooters alive who could make it is very small. You don't know me, Mara said. You know my father. Spent 3 hours watching you work, Voss said. I know the difference between someone performing competence and someone who has it. You have it. He paused. But I also know that knowing something in a command building and executing it on a ridgeline at dawn are 2 different propositions. That's why we're not going to talk ourselves into certainty, Mara said. Exactly right. They sat in silence for a while. The wind moved across the building. Coffee cooled. At some point, without planning to, Mara put her arms on the table and her head on her arms and was asleep in under 2 minutes. She slept for exactly an hour and 40 minutes. When she woke, Voss was sitting in the same position across the table, his own coffee untouched and cold, going over her wind models with a pencil and making small annotations in the margins. He didn't comment on the fact that she'd slept. She didn't comment on the fact that he hadn't. Picked up her coffee. Drank it cold. Ready? She asked. I've been ready since 2003, Voss said. He set the pencil down. Let's go finish what your father started. Outside, the Afghan dark was absolute and cold and enormous, the stars brilliant at altitude, the ridgelines invisible black shapes, against a sky that had too many lights in it. Mara picked up her father's rifle case, felt the familiar weight settle into her grip, and walked out into it. Somewhere across the valley, a man who had never heard her name was sleeping, soundly. By morning, the distance between them would be the only thing that had ever truly protected him. And in 6 hours, that distance the route to the observation post, took 47 minutes. Reyes and Torres had gone ahead at 230, as planned. And by the time Mara and Voss reached the base of the northeastern ridgeline, a single infrared chemlight had been placed at the trail junction, invisible to the naked eye. A small green smear through her NOD monocular. She adjusted the device and kept moving. Voss was behind her. Neither of them spoke. The climb was not that technical, but it was demanding. The trail, such as it was, had been established by the scout element over their previous 2 ascents, not cut. Just identified, path of least resistance through loose shale and fractured granite that someone had marked with small cairns of stacked rock placed in positions a drone or a distant observer wouldn't identify as deliberate. The altitude was working against both of them within the first 10 minutes. At 8,200 feet already, the ridgeline observation post sat somewhere above 9,200, and the air thinned noticeably between the 2 points. Mara's breathing regulated into a controlled cadence. She'd done enough high-altitude work to know that fighting the altitude cost more than accepting it. Carried the rifle case in her right hand and switched it to her left every 8 minutes. Her pack held the ammunition boxes, a spotting scope, a wind meter, a laser rangefinder, 2 liters of water, a thermal blanket, and a handheld radio. The total weight was just over 40 pounds. She didn't notice it after the first 15 minutes. You either built the load into your body before the climb, or you suffered for it after. She'd spent 2 days before deployment doing weighted ruck marches at altitude simulation in Fort Carson's hypoxic training facility. That suffering had been intentional. Torres materialized out of the dark at the 2/3 mark of the climb, appearing from behind a rock formation with the specific quality of stillness that good operators cultivated present before you realized he'd arrived. Route's clear, he said quietly. No sign of activity in the valley. Rock surface in the last 200 meters moderate frost on the north-facing sections, clear on the south. There's a ledge formation at the final position that gives you a natural rest, but it's narrow. Maybe 18 inches of stable surface. Orientation? Mara asked. Points northeast at approximately 40 degrees. You'll have the compound dead on from the firing position. Wind at the ridge when we came through was light and variable, but that was 40 minutes ago. It'll change again before first light, Mara said. Always does up here. Torres looked at the rifle case. You want me to carry that last section? No, she said, without making it anything other than a simple statement of fact. Thank you. He nodded and fell in behind Voss. They moved on. The observation post was a natural rock depression, approximately 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, positioned just below the true ridgeline, so that an observer inside it was screened from the valley below by the rock lip, but had a clear line of sight across the valley when looking through or over the forward edge. Someone Reyes probably had laid a thin foam pad along the forward firing surface and placed a small windbreak of loose rock on the left side to reduce the vortex effect that the ridgeline gap created. Mara unpacked in silence. The rifle came out first. She inspected the action by touch in the dark, running her fingers across the bolt, the trigger guard, the safety, each component confirming itself to her by feel alone. Her father had made her do this blindfolded until she was 12. By 14, she could field strip and reassemble the rifle without light in under 4 minutes. She hadn't timed herself in years. Some things you simply retained. Voss set up the spotting scope on a low tripod to her right, positioning it so he could read the valley without compromising her firing position. He worked quietly and efficiently, the movements of someone who had done this enough times that it existed below the level of conscious thought. Reyes settled into a position 6 feet back and to the left, where he could monitor the radio without the sound carrying forward to the ridge lip. Torres took a covering position at the back of the depression, facing their approach route. 448 hours, the valley was still entirely dark, and the wind was doing something complicated. Mara watched her wind meter for 20 minutes before she said anything. The reading was cycling between 3 and 11 knots from the northwest, west, with periodic lulls that lasted between 8 and 15 seconds, and occasional spikes that pushed the meter past 15 before dropping back. None of that was surprising. What interested her was the pattern of the lulls. They weren't random. There was a rough periodicity to them, approximately every 4 to 7 minutes, that suggested a larger weather system moving through the gap in the northwestern ridgeline at intervals rather than continuously. "You seeing this?" she said quietly to Voss. He was watching the same data on a secondary meter he'd positioned at the forward edge. "The lull pattern. Yes. It's not consistent enough to rely on, but if the pattern holds through morning, I might be able to time the shot to a lull." "The window is 60 to 90 seconds, Voss said. "If a lull presents within the first 30 seconds of the window, you take it. If not, then I work with what I have." She paused. "What's the deviation on a 12-knot perpendicular crosswind at this range with my load?" "Approximately 20 inches at 2,200 meters. High right if the wind is from the northwest. 20 inches is outside the margin." "It is. Then we need a lull." Voss agreed. He said it the way someone said the car needs an alignment, acknowledging a mechanical reality without dramatizing it. Mara laid the rifle on the foam pad and settled into position behind it. She spent 15 minutes finding her natural point of aim, the position in which her body was genuinely aligned with the target axis rather than muscling the rifle onto it. This mattered at any range. At 2,200 meters, a shooter fighting their own body alignment instead of working with it introduced errors that compounded over the bullet's flight time in ways that couldn't be corrected for after the fact. She shifted her position 3 times before it felt right. Then she worked her way down into it completely, letting her weight settle, letting her breathing find its own depth and pace. Through the scope, the distant ridgeline on the far side of the valley was a dark shape against a sky that was beginning to differentiate itself from the land at its lowest horizon. The compound wasn't visible yet in any meaningful way. It was a slightly different quality of darkness against the rock face. That would change with the light. "Range check," she said. Voss put the laser rangefinder on the eastern balcony. 2,240 meters to the balcony railing. 2,260 to the doorway. 20 meters difference between entry point and standing position. Mattered. A bullet dropped significantly in that final 20 meters of flight at this range, that not inches, but potentially enough to affect point of impact if she was holding for the railing distance and he was standing near the door. "I'll split the difference," she said. 2,250. That works. She plugged the number into her mental ballistic calculation, cross-referencing it with the environmental data she'd been building since the previous afternoon. At 500 hours, the temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure had been declining slightly since midnight, consistent with the approaching weather system. Humidity was low. Altitude was working in her favor. On the aerodynamic front, thinner air meant less drag. But the density-altitude effect on the powder charge was a factor she'd already accounted for in the load development. She came up with a firing solution. wrote it on a small piece of tape, and pressed it to the stock where she could read it without moving her eye from the scope. Then she waited. Waiting was the part nobody photographed. Nobody made movies about the 40-minute stretch between when you got into position and when anything happened. The specific quality of immobility that long-range shooting demanded, not passive, not restful, but an active, effortful stillness that required constant micromanagement of breath, muscle tension, thought patterns, and peripheral awareness. Mara had spent more accumulated hours in this state than she could calculate. She'd been in position for longer waits, with higher stakes and harder conditions. None of that made the current waiting easy. It just made it manageable. Her mind, denied the option of fidgeting, did what it always did in these intervals. Sorted. She thought about the 3 previous shooters who had declared the engagement non-viable. She didn't know their names, but she knew the type experienced. Methodical, risk-aware operators who had looked at the data and made a reasonable professional judgment. They weren't wrong about the difficulty. Voss had said as much. Problem was that difficulty was not the same variable as impossibility, and in the space between those two concepts lived a very specific subset of decisions that changed outcomes. Her father used to call it the edge. The edge isn't where most people think it is. He'd told her once, on the back porch of their Wyoming property, watching through binoculars while she's spotting targets at 600 yards. Most people think the edge is the limit of the equipment. It's not. The equipment's edge and the shooter's edge are 2 different lines. A good shooter moves their line out past the equipment's and then brings the equipment up to meet it. A great shooter moves their line so far out that the equipment's edge becomes irrelevant. She'd been 17. She'd thought she understood what he meant. 31, lying on a rock ledge in Afghanistan in the dark with a dead man's rifle. She understood it differently. The edge wasn't about confidence or willpower or any of the language that got used around high-performance contexts. It was about honest assessment of what the physics actually permitted and then positioning yourself technically, mentally, physically to operate at that precise point without retreating from it. 3 previous shooters had assessed the physics and retreated. Not from cowardice, from a rational calculation that the risk-reward equation didn't favor the attempt. What they hadn't accounted for was that some variables weren't fixed. Wind was a variable. Time of shot selection was a variable. Load development was a variable. Spotter quality was a variable. Physical and cognitive state of the shooter on the day was a variable. Change enough variables, shift the equation. She'd spent 2 years developing the load in the rifle below her chin. She had Voss reading the wind beside her. She had a behavioral pattern on the target that gave her a known window rather than an unpredictable opportunity. Previous shooters had been assessed against a static set of conditions. Her conditions were different. She believed that. She also knew that belief wasn't the same as certainty, and certainty was, as her father had said, and Voss had repeated, a liar. She held both of those things at the same time. Confidence in the preparation. Humility about the execution. The 2 didn't contradict each other. They were the same posture, looked at from different angles. 541 hours, the sky began to lighten in a serious way. The valley resolved itself out of the dark. In stages, first the ridgelines, then the upper slopes, then the valley floor. Color coming up gray and cold and flattening everything until the sun cleared the eastern horizon and started throwing angled light across the rock faces. Compound became visible as a distinct structure against the far ridgeline. Stone walls, a flat roof, the eastern face catching direct light while the western section stayed in shadow. The balcony was clearly visible, a narrow cantilevered platform, iron railing, maybe 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Mara had been looking at it in satellite imagery for 11 hours. Seeing it in real space at real distance resolved it into something different, something that had weight. She let that weight register without pushing it away. Denying the reality of what she was about to do didn't make her better at it. It just moved the reckoning to a worse moment. "Compound is up," Voss said quietly. "I have it." She settled her scope reticle on the balcony doorway. The distance was enormous in the scope, even at maximum magnification. The balcony was small, the doorway a dark rectangle against the stone facade. She identified the railing, the wall edge, the overhang above. She ran through the firing solution one more time. Confirmed the elevation hold. Confirmed the wind compensation. The wind meter was reading 6 knots from the northwest. A lull had passed 3 minutes earlier, lasting 11 seconds. "What's the period on the lulls?" she asked. Voss checked his log. "Longest gap between lulls so far has been 8 minutes. Shortest has been 3. We're at 3 minutes since the last one. If the pattern holds, we should get another within the next 5 minutes. If the pattern holds." She knew better than to rely on that. Webb didn't sign contracts, but she factored it into the background of her planning and kept her focus on the doorway. 614 hours. 16 minutes to the window. The radio at Reyes's position gave a single low squelch. He reached over and keyed the handset once in response, a pre-arranged signal. Contact acknowledged, all elements in position. Somewhere 12 kilometers to the east, a pair of little birds was sitting on a dry riverbed with their rotors tied. Crews in the cockpit, waiting for the word. "Movement on the roof," Torres said from behind. Mara didn't move her scope from the balcony doorway, but she tracked it in her peripheral awareness. Voss shifted his spotting scope. 2 personnel, Voss said. "Looks like a security sweep, moving counterclockwise around the roofline." This was expected. The intelligence package had noted a pre-dawn security pattern, 2 guards making a circuit of the roof and upper exterior walls before the morning routine began. Their presence meant the window was approaching, not that it was compromised. She watched the doorway. 619 hours. 622 hours. The wind spiked. 14 knots. Dropped back to 8. "Anything?" she asked. "Negative," Voss said. "Guards are off the roof. Interior light behind the balcony door." Interior light. Someone inside the room, behind the balcony, moving around. Getting ready. Her index finger moved to the trigger guard. Not inside it, just adjacent to it. The placement was automatic, the result of 10,000 repetitions, a position that allowed for a smooth, uninterrupted movement to the trigger when the moment came, without anticipating that moment prematurely. 627 hours. 3 minutes to window open. The wind dropped. She checked the meter. 2 knots, then 1. Then the meter read essentially 0, the small vein on its head barely trembling. A lull. "Lull," Voss said at the same moment she registered it. 9 seconds. She watched the doorway. Nothing. The wind came back. 7 knots. "He's late," she said. Not to anyone specifically, just to the air. "Window is 60 to 90 seconds from 0630, Voss said. "We're at 27. Still in the range. If he's at the far end of the range, the lull we just had is gone." "Yes. 630 hours. She breathed. Controlled and slow, the kind of breathing that kept the scope image stable, not suppressing the body's function, but working within it. The slight rise and fall of the crosshairs. With each breath cycle, a familiar rhythm she could. Time her trigger press around. The doorway remained dark. 631 hours. Reyes shifted position behind her. She heard the faint sound of his radio handset moving. Nothing on the net. He settled back. 632 hours. The doorway moved. Not dramatically a change in the quality of the darkness behind the door, a shift in the interior shadow that indicated something approaching from inside. Then the door opened. It opened inward, which she hadn't been able to determine from the satellite imagery, and it opened slowly, a hand pushing it from the interior. "Movement," Voss said. She was already tracking it. A figure stepped out onto the balcony. Male, medium height, wearing a dark jacket, a cloth wrapped at the neck. Moving deliberately, not rushed. He came out 2 steps and stopped. His posture was the specific posture of a man in a habitual place, relaxed in the particular way of someone doing something they've done hundreds of times, who no longer thinks consciously about the doing of it. "Confirm identity," Mara said. Her voice was completely level. Voss had a second spotting scope with a higher magnification eyepiece, specifically for this moment. "Stand by, 4 seconds, confirmed. Subject is HVI-7. Positive identification on facial features and identifying characteristics scar through the left eyebrow, consistent with file photograph." She had the man in her crosshairs. The reticle sat on the center of his torso, adjusted for her elevation and windage hold. The wind meter read 5 knots. Northwest. That was workable. She adjusted her hold to moe, right to compensate, moving the reticle off-center to the position where the bullet would cross the path of where his center mass would be when the round arrived. He turned to face east as predicted. His profile was to her now a narrower target, but still viable. She confirmed her natural point of aim, confirmed the firing solution. Let 1 complete breath cycle pass. The wind spiked. 12 knots. The meter jumped hard, and her peripheral vision caught the dust moving across the valley floor in a fast, visible wave, not a gust, but a surge. The kind of lateral wind movement that would push her round almost 2 feet wide at this distance. She did not press the trigger. She came off the firing solution and tracked the wind meter. The surge lasted 6 seconds and dropped back to 7. "That was close," Torres said quietly from behind her. Nobody responded to him. Mara re-established her firing solution. The subject was still on the balcony. He'd moved slightly, leaning his forearms on the railing now, which actually steadied his position relative to her reference points. She adjusted her reticle. The wind was at 7 knots, fluctuating between 6 and 8. 7 knots. Her deviation calculation was approximately 11 inches of right drift. She adjusted her hold to account for it. 634 hours. The window was 4 minutes old. She had somewhere between 0 and 30 seconds remaining before the window closed. There was no way to know exactly. She hadn't fired yet. The previous lull had passed unused. The wind was not cooperating fully, but it was cooperating partially. 7 knots was not ideal, but it was within the margin of what her hold adjustment could address. She thought about the little birds, 12 kilometers out. The assault team staged and waiting. Reyes with his hand near the radio. The senior chief back at Redstone watching a clock. She thought about her father, who had made a shot at 1,900 meters with iron sights and a crosswind, and who had told her later that he'd almost missed, and whose lesson from that near miss had been about accounting for what you didn't know. She thought about Holloway's face when she'd walked into his command room. The weight of the 8 pairs of eyes that had catalogued her rank and her gender and her quiet manner, and had calculated silently but unmistakably that she was not what they needed. She breathed out. The wind dropped, not to 0 to 3 knots, nudging toward 2. Not a lull, a softening, brief, uncertain, possibly lasting 5 seconds or possibly lasting 20. "Wind is dropping," Voss said, his voice barely above a whisper. She adjusted her hold. 3 knots. Deviation of approximately 4 inches at this range. She moved the reticle to account for it, confirmed the elevation hold, confirmed her natural point of aim had not shifted. The man on the balcony was leaning on the railing. His right shoulder was toward her. His head was turned east, toward the sun coming over the far mountains. She found the spot she wanted, confirmed it, took half a breath, part of it out, stopped, applied pressure to the trigger. Trigger broke at 4 pounds 2 ounces. She knew this number, the way she knew her own name, and the rifle fired. The recoil pushed back into her shoulder, exactly as she expected, and she called the shot from the scope image in the fractional moment before the recoils disrupted her sight picture, center mass, slightly right of her intended point. The The bullet was in the air. At this distance, that meant a full 2.5 seconds of flight time, 2,240 meters. And at approximately 930 meters per second muzzle velocity, minus velocity loss over distance, terrain effects, specific aerodynamics of the projectile in dry air at altitude. 2.5 seconds, she maintained position behind the scope and tracked back to the balcony. Voss was already reading it. Those 2.5 seconds stretched out into something that had no useful comparison to ordinary time, not slow, not fast, but expanded, each fraction of them containing its own weight. Then Voss said one word. He said it quietly, without triumph, in the tone of a man reading a gauge that has given him a reading he needed. Hit, and everything on the far ridgeline began to move at once. Figure on the balcony dropped in a way that was distinct from the way people fell when they lost balance or stumbled a collapse without correction. The body surrendering its vertical orientation completely in a single instant. From this distance, through this scope, it was small and almost abstract. Mara registered it as data. Confirmed hit, Voss said. Subject is down on the balcony. No movement. Mara didn't respond immediately. She was already tracking right, reading the compound perimeter, watching for the secondary problem she'd flagged in her threat assessment the previous afternoon. A fighting position on the northwestern corner of the compound wall that the satellite imagery had, identified as a potential crew-served weapon emplacement. The imagery had been inconclusive about whether it was manned or simply a prepared position. The answer to that question arrived 6 seconds after the shot. Muzzle, flash. Northeast corner of the compound wall, slightly below the roofline. Heavy caliber, the sound reached her. A moment later, a low thumping percussion carried across the valley. Not aimed at her position. Aimed east, skyward, toward the approach corridor the helicopters would use. They hadn't anticipated the helicopters yet, but they were oriented correctly by accident or by doctrine, and the two little birds coming in from 12 kilometers east would fly directly into that field of fire. Machine gun, she said. Northeast corner, Voss confirmed. He was already on the rangefinder. 1,600 meters to the emplacement. She was already cycling the bolt. The spent case ejected and the second round chambered. She brought the reticle to the muzzle flash position on the compound wall, a different distance, a different angle. The whole firing solution changed. Reyes's radio came alive. She heard the little bird's call sign. In a burst of traffic, she couldn't fully decode from her position, but the urgency in the transmission frequency told her what she needed to know. 1,600 meters. The wind had shifted northeast in the compound's valley sector, so she could see it in the dust below. The pattern changing after the main surge had moved through. Probably 8 knots now, from a slightly different angle. She didn't have time to rebuild the full solution. She worked from what she had, adjusted the elevation down for the shorter range, compensated for the wind shift. Ready, Voss said. She found the muzzle flash position. Crew-served weapon was still firing. She could see the flash signature clearly now. Intermittent bursts, the crew working the gun in disciplined short strings rather than holding the trigger, which told her they were trained personnel rather than irregular fighters. Trained personnel at a crew-served weapons at 1,600 meters. Her crosshair settled on the position. She pressed the trigger. The second shot broke across the valley before the echo of the first had fully died. At 1,600 meters, the bullet's flight time was just under 2 seconds faster than the longer shot. The trajectory flatter, the margin for error smaller in a different way. Less time for the wind to work on it. Less time for anything. She'd built the solution in under 8 seconds from a cold start on a new target at a new range with a wind she'd estimated rather than confirmed. And the moment the trigger broke, she knew 2 things simultaneously. She'd held the position correctly, and that she had no way of knowing if it had been enough until Voss told her. She cycled the bolt, stayed on the compound wall. The muzzle flash from the crew-served position had stopped. "Stand by," Voss said. He had the spotting scope on the emplacement, his body completely still, reading whatever was happening at 1,600 meters through a 40-power eyepiece. 3 seconds. 4. "Gun is down," he said. "I can see the position crew is not at the weapon." "Repeat, gun is down." Reyes was already on the radio. "Overwatch to Raptor flight. Threat is neutralized. Northeast corner. You are clear on approach." "Repeat, you are clear." The response came back, clipped and fast, the pilot's voice tight with the specific compression of someone who'd been watching a machine gun track toward them and had just been told it stopped. "Raptor copies. Inbound. 3 minutes." Mara held her position behind the rifle. She tracked across the compound perimeter west wall, south wall, the main gate, the rooftop. Compound was in visible chaos from this distance. She could see figures moving on the roof and along the interior wall walks, but the movement was reactive, disorganized, men responding to a threat they couldn't locate rather than executing a defensive plan. Primary target was down. The crew-served weapon was silent. The assault element was 3 minutes out. She watched the north approach corridor, where the little birds would come in low and fast over the ridgeline. "Torres," she said without looking back. "Yeah, watch the south wall. There's a secondary fighting position in the satellite imagery, lower left corner of the south face. It wasn't manned in the pre-dawn imagery, but that was 3 hours ago." On it, Voss had shifted the spotting scope to the north approach. "Little birds will cross the ridge at the gap. If there's any air defense capability on the compounds." "There isn't," Mara said. "The intel package ruled out manpads." "Watch the roof anyway." "I am watching the roof." She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't during a firing sequence, not elevated exactly, but present, each beat a distinct physical event rather than background noise. The first shot always did something to the body's chemistry that the subsequent ones didn't quite repeat. She'd learned to recognize the feeling without letting it mean anything. It was information. It wasn't instruction. The radio gave another burst of traffic. Caught fragments, Raptor flight, calling, the ridge crossing, then the assault team's net coming alive with short position calls, the specific clipped shorthand of operators moving fast toward an objective. 90 seconds, Reyes said from behind her. She kept the scope on the compound. The little birds came over the ridge fast and low, hugging the terrain in a way that put the ridgeline between them and any ground observation moment until the last possible moment. She heard them before she saw them, the distinctive high RPM sound of the MD-500 variant cutting through the cold air, a sound that had a particular quality at altitude that was different from any other aircraft. Then they cleared the ridge and dropped into the valley approach. 2 birds in staggered formation. The assault teams visible on the external seats operators, hanging off the side, mounts with weapons up. The whole package moving at 120 knots toward a compound that now had no primary commander and no functioning crew-served weapon. Tracked the approach. Watched the compound walls. Nobody on the roof was tracking the aircraft with any kind of coordinated fire. There was small arms fire, sporadic and undisciplined, muzzle flashes from the wall walks and the main gate area, but nothing sustained. Nothing with the signature of organized defensive action. The birds flared hard at the compound perimeter, and the operators were off the mounts before the skids touched down. She heard the first bang of a breaching charge over the distance, a flat crack that reached her, a moment after the visual of the gate coming apart. Then the radio traffic went dense and fast and overlapping, the assault team moving through their breach sequence, room calls and clear signals, and the occasional harder sound of a weapon firing in the close spaces of the compound interior. Mara held her position. Her job now was overwatch, watching the exterior for anyone attempting to exit, reinforcements approaching from outside, anything that required a long-range response. She tracked the perimeter walls, the approach roads, on both the north and south faces, the small outbuilding 40 meters east of the main compound that the intelligence package had flagged as a possible secondary shelter. Movement, Torre said. East outbuilding. Door is opening. Pivoted the rifle. The outbuilding was at roughly 2,200 meters, nearly the same distance as the primary shot. The door was open. A figure appeared in it, not running, not armed visibly. Hands up, moving out of the building slowly with the specific body language of someone who decided that survival outranked whatever other calculation they'd been running. Not a threat, she said. Hands up, moving away from the building. Confirmed, Voss said, the spotting scope on it. Adult male, unarmed, hands elevated. Moving north toward the compound main gate, moving toward the assault team, in other words. Surrendering or appearing to. She kept the reticle on him until he'd cleared the open ground and was in the compound's shadow, within the assault team's line of sight. The radio traffic inside the compound was settling. Longer gaps between transmissions, the specific change in rhythm that indicated the active clearing phase was giving way to the consolidation phase. At 702 hours 32 minutes after the primary shot, the assault team leader's voice came over the net. Steady, professional. The adrenaline banked back to something quieter. Overwatch. This is Raptor 6. Compound is secure. 2 personnel detained for exploitation. Primary target confirmed deceased on the eastern balcony. Sensitive site exploitation is beginning. We are Oscar Mike on the secondary objectives. Reyes keyed his handset. Overwatch copies. Raptor 6. Good hunting. A pause. Then, tell your shooter good hunting too. Reyes looked at Mara. She was already breaking down the firing position, not from impatience, but because the tactical situation no longer required her behind the rifle, and holding a position past its operational necessity was how people made mistakes. She unloaded the remaining rounds from the magazine, safed the weapon, began the process of returning it to the case. You could take a breath first, Reyes said. I'm breathing, she said. He watched her for a moment. Then he went back to his radio. The descent took 40 minutes and was easier than the climb, which was always a mild psychological trick that Mara had learned not to trust. Easier descents produced carelessness. She moved the same way going down as she had going up, deliberate, measured, the rifle case in hand, attention on the surface ahead of each step. Voss was behind her, quiet, and she noticed that he moved on the descent the same way she did, without the loosening of attention that most people showed when the hard part appeared to be over. The base was wide awake when they came back through the perimeter. She was aware of eyes on her differently this time. Quality of attention had changed. At the vehicle checkpoint, the Air Force Master Sergeant with the clipboard, who had met her on the pad that morning, saw her coming and said nothing, but he stepped aside and held the gate barrier up. She hadn't done when she'd passed through the previous day. She noted it without comment. In the operations center, the mood was the specific combination of controlled professional satisfaction and exhausted relief that followed a successful mission. Imagery analysts were processing the drone footage. An intelligence officer was on a secure video link, presumably feeding the sensitive site exploitation data upstream. 2 SEALs from the assault element were seated at a table with their gear spread around them, doing the immediate post-mission maintenance that good operators did regardless of how tired they were. Calloway was at the main map table. He turned when she came in, and she saw something move across his face that she hadn't seen there before a recalibration, visible even in a man whose expressions were generally as informative as polished stone. It lasted a fraction of a second. Then his face went back to professional neutral. Sergeant Calloway. Sir, the shot on the primary target. He paused. Voss confirmed the solution? Colonel Voss spotted for the primary engagement and confirmed the hit, she said. Secondary engagement on the crew-served weapon position was an independent firing solution developed under time pressure. Different range, different wind estimate. How much time to develop the secondary solution? Approximately 8 seconds. Holloway was quiet for a moment. The assault team leader's after-action assessment indicates that the crew-served position would have had a direct engagement window on the little birds at their approach angle for approximately 11 seconds before terrain would have masked the aircraft. 8 seconds to develop a solution. 2 seconds of flight time. 10 seconds total. She didn't say anything. The math was available to anyone in the room. 2 detained personnel, Holloway continued, include one individual who the team has preliminarily identified as Karimi's operations coordinator. The identification holds, the intelligence value is significant. That's good news, sir. It is. He picked up a folder from the table, set it down again without opening it. A gesture that meant he was doing something with his hands while his mind was somewhere else. My 3 previous assessment shooters were all competent operators. I want to be clear that their assessments reflected a reasonable interpretation of the engagement conditions. I understand that, sir. What I'm trying to say, Sergeant, is that my decision to question this assignment when you arrived was based on my reading of the situation, which was, as it turns out, incomplete. She held his gaze. You had a reasonable basis for your reading, sir. I wasn't on your record. You had no verified performance data on me at the engagement range. Given the stakes, asking the question was the correct call. Something shifted in Holloway's expression. Not quite surprise, more like the look of a person who'd braced for one thing and received a different thing. You're being generous, he said. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he gave a single nod, the kind that settled something. Debrief in 1 hour, he said. I want you and Voss present. Yes, sir. The debrief was thorough and clinical, the way good debriefs were not congratulatory, not post-game celebration, but a methodical reconstruction of the sequence of events, decision point examined and documented, each variable logged against the outcome. Holloway ran it himself. He was a precise interviewer, asking questions that cut directly to the information he wanted without preamble. Mara walked through the targeting sequence, the wind assessment, the decision timing, the secondary engagement. Voss corroborated and supplemented from the spotter's perspective. The intelligence officer asked 3 questions about the behavioral pattern and observation, and confirmed that the pattern data was consistent with what the drone surveillance had shown. At the end, the senior chief whose name she'd learned was Haverford put a printout on the table. It was a laser rangefinder readout, the measurement Voss had taken the previous night before they'd moved to the hide. The range to the primary target position. 2,240 meters, Haverford said. He let that sit for a moment. For reference, the longest confirmed combat engagement in this theater in the past 8 years was 1,800 meters, carried out by a British operator in Helmand. Nobody in the room spoke. Previous longest engagement, attributed to a U.S. military shooter in Afghanistan, was 1650, Haverford continued. That was a SEAL sniper in 2011. Chief, Holloway said. Sir, this is a debrief, not a record book session. Yes, sir. Haverford gathered the print and set it aside. But the number had been said. It was in the room now. Everyone who had watched her walk in from that aircraft pad, carrying the old rifle case, wearing her staff sergeant's rank, not the face or the unit designation they'd expected, was now doing the same arithmetic, and it was producing results that none of their prior calibrations had predicted. She felt the shift in the room's temperature the way you felt a change in altitude. Not abrupt, gradual, a pressure change. Voss, seated beside her, did not look at her during this exchange. He was looking at the map, but she noticed that his hands, folded on the table in front of him, had relaxed in a way they hadn't been when they'd walked in. After the debrief, Reyes found her in the corridor outside the operations center. Hey, she stopped. Hey, He had the direct, uncomplicated manner of someone who'd decided to say a thing and was saying it without embellishment. I want to apologize. When you first arrived, the way I looked at you. When you came in off the bird, I noticed, she said. I know. He paused. That's the apology. She looked at him for a moment. He was meeting her gaze without deflection, which she gave him credit for. It was harder than it sounded, making yourself hold eye contact with someone you'd underestimated and who you knew was aware of it. Accepted, she said. For what it's worth, the way you handled the secondary engagement. I was on the radio when that gun opened up. I know what was coming at those birds. He paused again. What you did in that window. 8 seconds. The solution wasn't elegant, she said. A cleaner approach would have had a pre-plotted solution on that position as a contingency. Why didn't you? Because the intelligence package rated the position as probably unmanned, and I accepted that assessment without running the contingency calculation anyway. That was a mistake. Reyes looked at her. You're talking about a mistake you made during the 8 seconds after successfully making a 2,200-meter shot under pressure. I'm talking about preparation, she said. The shot existing doesn't excuse the gap in preparation. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement. More like the slow processing of information that contradicted a prior model. Yeah, he said. Okay. He extended his hand. She shook it. 2 hours after the debrief, she was sitting on the south side of the operations building, in the thin afternoon sun, with Voss. Both of them with coffee. Neither of them with anywhere particular to be for the next several hours until transport was arranged. The sun was doing something complicated with the light on the valley. Below, warming the rock faces in long amber sections, while the shadowed areas stayed cold blue, the whole landscape refusing to commit to a single temperature. You mentioned your father's training method this morning, Voss said. The wind reading before the scope. Yes. He adapted it from something I showed him in 2003. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. A technique for reading microterrain wind behavior using vegetation movement at multiple distance bands, simultaneously, rather than relying on a single reference point. He took it and made it better. Added the thermal component. Called it the layered read, Mara said. That's a better name than what I called it. What did you call it? Voss's expression did something that was close to amusement. I called it looking at stuff. She laughed. It came out without planning, short, genuine, and surprising enough that she noticed it afterward. Couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed in the field. Felt slightly out of place and entirely appropriate at the same moment. Voss smiled, which changed his face more than she would have expected. He would have appreciated this morning, he said. Not the outcome specifically. The application. Watching you use what he built. He would have found 12 things I did wrong, Mara said. He would have found 12 things you did wrong, and then told someone else they were. 12 things you did exactly right, Voss said. That's how he taught. He didn't correct you to your face. Corrected you obliquely, through subsequent instruction. So you absorbed the lesson without defending against it. Mara was quiet for a moment. I didn't know he did that. I thought the lessons were the lessons. I didn't realize they were corrections. That was the method, Voss said. If you know you're being corrected, part of your attention goes to managing the fact of being corrected. He wanted your full attention on the technique. She thought about that, about specific memories of her father on the back property in Wyoming, at ranges in Montana and Idaho, where he'd taken her during the summers, in the field at her first qualification course when she'd been 23 and he'd shown up as a civilian observer, which she'd thought at the time was just him being present. Now she was reinterpreting every memory through a different lens, seeing the architecture of a teaching method she'd lived inside without being aware of its shape. He was a complicated man, she said. The best ones usually are, Voss said. It wasn't a platitude. It was an observation delivered with the specific weight of someone who'd known the man being discussed and was commenting from that knowledge. They sat in the thin sun for a while. The valley stretched below them, the compound on the far ridgeline visible from this angle as a small dark shape against the rock. The assault team's vehicles still staged at the gate in a pattern visible even at this distance. "What happens now?" Voss asked. She looked at him. "For me or for all of this?" "Either. For all of this, the detained personnel go into the exploitation pipeline. The intelligence gets worked. Whatever comes from what they recovered in the compound gets actioned. That's not my part of it." She looked back at the valley. "For me, I go back to Fort Carson, back to my unit, back to whatever is on the training calendar for November. And the rifle?" She thought about the question. It was a different question than it seemed. "Goes back in the case. Same as always. Your father carried it for 22 years in service," Voss said. "He told me once that he wasn't sure whether the rifle carried him or he carried it. He said the same thing to me, about a year before he died." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I think I understand it differently now than I did when he said it." "How did you understand it then?" "I thought he meant the weight, that the rifle was heavy and he'd been carrying it a long time." She paused. "I think he meant something else." "What do you think he meant?" "I think he meant that the rifle represented everything he'd done with it. Every decision, every shot, every outcome. And whether he was carrying the rifle or it was carrying him depended on whether he could look at those things clearly." She looked at the rifle case leaning against the building wall beside her. "Some days you carry it. Some days it carries you." Voss was quiet for a long moment. "He was right to give it to you." "He didn't give it to me," Mara said. "He left it to me." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "He gave me everything else before he died. The methods, the knowledge, the years of working beside him. The rifle was the last thing. He left it so there'd still be something to receive after he was gone." She looked at Voss directly. "So I'd still have something to carry." Voss looked at the rifle case. Then back at the valley, the sun was moving west, and the light on the far ridgeline was changing, the amber deepening, the shadows extending. In another hour, the valley would be cold and dark again, and the compound would disappear into the same darkness it had emerged from this morning, only with different people inside it, and different intelligence, moving through different networks toward different consequences. A full day's work, in other words. She finished her coffee. The grounds had made it most of the way up the cup, which told her the machine in the operations building needed servicing. "Voss," she said. "Yes, the spotter field log you mentioned when you arrived. The one from your career." He turned to look at her. "I'd like to read it," she said, "if that's something you'd be willing to share." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket, not dramatically, just a simple reach, and produced a battered green field notebook, the kind issued by the military in the 1980s, that hadn't been standard issue for 30 years. Cover was worn through at the corners, and the binding had been reinforced twice with different types of tape. He set it on his knee and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the wall between them, not handed it. Set it between them, in the neutral space, a different gesture. "Start at the Hellman section," he said. "Page 47. He paused. "There are notes in the margins, in a different handwriting getting on page 51. Mara looked at the notebook. She recognized the handwriting before he said anything else. Her father's hand, neat, compressed, the specific formation of letters she'd watched fill hundreds of pages over the years. She picked up the notebook carefully, the way you picked up something that was both ordinary and irreplaceable. "He added to it," she said. "Every time we were in the same place, long enough," Voss said, which was not often after 2003, but occasionally. The last entry in his hand is on page 88. He paused. "I haven't been able to write anything on page 89. She opened the notebook to page 47. The first line of the Hellman section was in Voss's compressed, efficient handwriting, March 2003. Wind out of the west, variable. Temperature at elevation 28 Fahrenheit. engagement range 100 meters. And then, below it, a ballistic table, a wind chart, notes on the specific vegetation in the observation area, the kind of granular documentation that accumulated only over years of serious fieldwork. She turned to page 51. Her father's handwriting appeared in the left margin, running vertically beside a passage of Voss's text. Wind reading method needs a fourth band at 600 meters. The gap between 400 and 800 creates a blind spot in crossing wind assessment. See, technique for using dust movement at distance. Closed the notebook. Not because she didn't want to read it, because there was too much of it to absorb at once, and she could feel the weight of it, not just the pages, but everything they represented, and she needed to carry that weight correctly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Voss said. "You haven't read page 88. She looked at him. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully read, not sadness exactly, but it's more caught a but its more complex cousin, the feeling of something important having happened a long time ago that you're still in the process of understanding. What's on page 88? Voss picked up his empty coffee cup, looked at it. "Set it down your name," he said simply. The afternoon light moved across the valley below them, slow and golden and indifferent to everything it touched, the way good light always was present, without agenda, illuminating without commentary. The same light that had been falling on this particular arrangement of rock and sky for 10,000 years before any of them had arrived, and would fall on it for 10,000 years after they were gone. Mara held the field notebook in both hands and said nothing. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be received. And in the long quiet that followed, somewhere across the valley in a compound that had been a fortress this morning, and was now a crime scene, the work of the day was still being processed and documented and moved forward through channels she would never fully see carrying consequences. She had set in motion with 2 trigger presses from a rock ledge at 8,200 feet in the cold pre-dawn of an October morning, with her father's rifle and a dead man's notebook and 40 years of accumulated knowledge pointing in the same direction at the same moment. She had come to Iron Ridge as the soldier nobody had been waiting for. She was leaving as something else entirely. The word for it hadn't arrived yet, but she could feel it coming. She read page 88 that night. She waited until after evening chow, after the second round of intelligence updates, after Voss had turned in and the operations center had settled into its overnight rhythm of low voices and monitor light. She found a corner of the comms tent that was unoccupied, sat on an equipment case with her back to the canvas wall, and opened the notebook to the last page with writing on it. Her father's hand, the same compressed deliberate lettering she'd watched, fill the margins of ballistic manuals and range cards and field notebooks her entire childhood. The date at the top was 14 months before he died, which meant he'd known by then the diagnosis had come 6 months before that, and Robert Calloway had responded to it the way he responded to most things that could not be argued with, by getting organized. The entry was not long. Her father had never used 3 words when 2 would do. November. Voss, if this finds you before Mara does, hold it for her. If she finds you first, which she will, give it to her when the time is right. You'll know the time. You always did. She's better than I was at her age. She's probably better than I was at any age, and I say that as someone who was not inclined to be generous about such assessments. The difference is that she doesn't know it yet. I kept it from her deliberately. You'll understand why. What she needs is not more technique. She has the technique. What she needs is the proof not for herself, but for everyone else. She's going to spend a significant portion of her career being the person in the room that no one expected. Make sure she has something in her hand when that happens. The rifle goes with her. You know what it means. Make sure she does too. Take care of yourself, Elias. You were a better spotter than you ever gave yourself credit for. RC, she read it 3 times. Then she closed the notebook and sat in the comms tent for a long time while the canvas moved in the night wind and a radio operator at the far end of the tent worked through a traffic log in a low monotone. Her father had known. He'd seen something in her that she hadn't been allowed to see as herself, not because she lacked the ability to see it, but because he'd made a calculated decision to withhold the mirror, to let the proof come from the world instead of from him. Because proof that came from a father's assessment of a daughter carried a discount that proof from a mountain valley in Afghanistan did not. She understood the method now. She understood all of it now. It didn't make her less angry about it. She sat with that anger the same way she sat with those things that were true and inconvenient, let it be present, didn't let it be in charge. After a while, she put the notebook in her jacket pocket, next to her chest, and went to find somewhere to sleep. The transport back to Bagram was scheduled for 1,400 hours the following day, which gave the morning to the kind of institutional activity that followed successful operations. Formal after-action documentation, equipment accountability checks, secure video debrief with theater command that Mara was required to attend, but not required to speak at length during. She attended in her ACUs, hair up, no concessions to the fact that the people on the other side of the video link represented 3 pay grades above Holloway. They were colonels and a general, and they looked at her the way people looked at something their data hadn't predicted. The general, a thin man, with the specific bearing of someone who had spent 40 years not wasting motion, asked her directly to walk through the primary engagement sequence. She did. He asked 2 follow-up questions about the wind assessment methodology. She answered them. He looked at something off-screen for a moment, then back at her. Staff Sergeant, your service record indicates you've been in for 9 years. Yes, sir. 3 deployments, 2 commendations. Advanced marksmanship course, top of class. He paused. Why are you still a staff sergeant? The question landed in the room with more weight than its 6 words should have carried. She felt Holloway shift slightly in his seat to her left. Haverford, standing near the door, didn't move. I've been focused on the work, sir, she said. The promotion cycle requires certain administrative milestones, and I've deprioritized some of them. Deprioritized, the general said. The word sat in his mouth like something he was tasting. You deprioritized a promotion from staff sergeant to sergeant first class. Yes, sir. Why? She considered the honest answer for exactly 1 second before deciding it was also the correct answer. Because the administrative track and the operational track don't always move in the same direction, sirs. I chose the operational track. The general looked at her for a long moment. That's a choice with consequences. I'm aware, sir. Are you? The consequence is that I walk into rooms as a staff sergeant and people make assessments based on that, she said. I've found those assessments useful. Another pause. The general looked at something off screen again. Useful. They tell me what I'm working with, sir. The general turned to someone off screen. A brief exchange she couldn't hear. Then back to her. We'll be in touch through your chain of command, Sergeant. He looked at Holloway. Admiral, good work. Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to the team. It always does. The general looked at Mara one more time, a look that was doing several things at once, most of which she couldn't fully decode. Calloway, sir. Your father would be. He stopped. Started again. The record stands for itself. The screen went to the SOCOM seal, and then to black. The room exhaled. Not dramatically, these were professionals, but the specific low-pressure release of a sustained formality ending was perceptible. Holloway stood, rolled his shoulders once, looked at Mara. The general knew your father, he said. They served together in the early 90s. He didn't say that because I don't think he knew how to say it in a debrief context. I gathered that, sir. His assessment of your engagement record is going into the formal documentation. Theater commander's copy. He paused. That's not routine. I understand. He looked at her for a moment. Walk with me. Professionally. They went outside into the mid-morning cold around the south side of the operations building where the wind was partially blocked by the rock formation that the base had been built against. Calloway moved without appearing to have a destination, just walking, the way senior people sometimes did when they needed to have a conversation that didn't fit inside a room. "I owe you a direct statement," he said. "Not in front of a room. Directly, sir. When you came off that aircraft, I judged you. Rank, uniform, the fact that you were Army, and I'd asked for a SOCOM qualified shooter. The fact that he paused. You know what the fact is. Gender," she said. "Yes." He said it without flinching from it. "I've been in this business 31 years. I'd like to tell you that 31 years of watching every background do extraordinary things has made me immune to that kind of snap assessment. It hasn't. I made it anyway." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "That assessment could have cost the mission. If I had sent you back and told command to find me someone else, You didn't, though," she said. "No, but the calculation that kept me from sending you back was not the right one. I didn't keep you because I evaluated your capability correctly. I kept you because Voss vouched for the rifle, and it bought you a window." He held her gaze. "It's not the same thing as believing in you, and you deserved the second thing." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the building's wind shadow, she could hear the base's ambient noise generators. Radio traffic from the comms tent, somewhere a vehicle engine turning over. "Admiral," she said. "Yes. My father spent 22 years being the best shooter in every room he walked into, and the argument about whether he belonged in the room happened every time he walked into a new one." She paused. "I've had 9 years of a smaller version of the same argument. I'm not interested in your guilt about it." Calloway's expression moved. "What I'm interested in," she continued, "is whether the documentation reflects the engagement accurately." "It does." "Then we're good, sir." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, because she'd seen versions of it before, the specific look of someone who had been carrying something and has just had it taken off their hands more cleanly than they expected. Not relief exactly. More like the recalibration that followed unexpectedly direct honesty. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Most things worth having aren't," she said. He almost smiled. "It was a close thing." "No," he said. "They're not." Back inside, Haverford found her at the equipment table where she was reassembling her pack. He set a challenge coin on the table in front of her without preamble. It was heavier than standard titanium, she thought. The task force emblem on one face, a ridge coordinate on the other. "Admiral wanted me to give you this," he said. She looked at it. Didn't pick it up immediately. He could have given it to me himself. He was going to. I told him I wanted to do it. Haverford leaned against the table with his arms folded. He was a large man, built the way certain operators, built not for appearance, just accumulated physical work over a long career, the kind of fitness that had no vanity in it. "I've been in special operations for 16 years. I've worked with the best shooters in the U.S. military. I've seen things I could describe in a debrief that would take 45 minutes to cover." "Okay," she said. "I've never seen a shot like the one you made this morning. Either of them." He paused. "I want to be clear that I'm not saying that as a compliment. I'm saying it as a fact. In the same way I'd say it's 32 degrees out and the wind is from the northwest. It's a factual statement." She looked at him. He was meeting her gaze with the directness of someone who'd decided the honest thing and the professional thing were pointing in the same direction. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I was one of the people in that room who made the assessment," he said. "When you walked in, I didn't say it out loud. But I made it." He unfolded his arms. "I spent 15 years learning to judge operators. I thought I was good at it. This morning taught me I have a blind spot." He nodded at the coin. "That's from the Admiral. The acknowledgement is from me." Picked up the coin. It was warm from his hand. "Haverford," she said. "Yeah. For what it's worth, the blind spot isn't unique to you. Structural. It's built into the way information moves through institutional channels." She turned the coin over. You can't entirely see past a structural bias by individual effort. What you can do is recognize it when you're looking at the output. He was quiet for a moment. Is that your way of saying, don't beat myself up about it? It's my way of saying, be precise about what the problem actually is. Personal guilt doesn't fix a structural problem. Accurate documentation does. Changed access does. Different decisions at the intake level do. She set the coin in her breast pocket. You made a bad assessment. That's recoverable. The question is, what happens the next time someone who doesn't look like the expected profile walks into a room? Haverford looked at her with an expression that had several components in it, and she could see him sorting through them. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I've had 9 years, she said. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I imagine you have. Voss found her after lunch, which had been adequate and nothing more. The specific quality of FOB food that was nutritious and texturally uneventful, and which she'd consumed without registering. She was at the rifle cleaning station, a dedicated table bolted to the exterior wall of the armory building, with rod holders and a solvent tray and a light overhead that someone had installed with more care than the rest of the base's ad hoc infrastructure. She had the rifle disassembled, the barrel removed, and was running a bore brush through the chamber end when he arrived. He sat down across from her and watched her work for a moment without speaking. She knew from the previous evening that his version of silence was a functional state rather than an uncomfortable one. So she let it be what it was and kept working. The general knew your father, Voss said finally. So Holloway mentioned. What Holloway probably doesn't know is that your father once refused to follow a direct order from that general when he was a colonel. Voss paused. It was the right call. The order was wrong. Your father saw it, said so, and refused. He spent 6 weeks under administrative review for it. She looked up. I didn't know that. No, he wouldn't have told you. It wasn't the kind of story he told. Voss turned his coffee cup in both hands, the same gesture she'd noticed before. A habitual thing when he was organizing his thoughts. Order, if followed, would have put a spotter in an exposed position during an extraction sequence. The calculation was that the spotter was an acceptable risk. Your father's assessment was that it was an unnecessary risk, that there was an alternative extraction, Restek, that would have preserved the position without exposing the spotter. Was he right? Yes. The alternative route was used after the review found in his favor. No casualties. Voss paused. The spotter was me. She set the bore brush down. He never told me, she said. He wouldn't have. He didn't refuse the order for acknowledgement. He refused it because it was wrong. Voss looked at her steadily. The general has carried that for 23 years. He's never said so directly, but I've watched him in rooms where Robert's name came up, and I know what it looks like when a person is carrying something. She thought about the way the general had stopped himself, mid-sentence, during the video debrief. Your father would be, and then the restart. The record stands for itself. He was going to say proud, she said. Probably. Couldn't finish it. No. She picked up the bore brush again, ran it through the chamber twice more, set it down, and reached for a clean patch. Voss, she said. Yes. Did my father know the general would be in that position, that he'd end up being the theater senior officer? Voss considered this. I don't think he planned for it specifically. I think he knew that the people who remembered what he'd done would eventually be in positions where it mattered. And I think he understood that the best argument he could make for the value of his judgment was not to be right once, but to have been right consistently over a career. He paused. And now you're part of that argument. She ran the clean patch through the barrel, held it up to the light. Acceptable. She ran a second one. I don't want to be an argument, she said. I know. But you are one anyway. He said it without apology. That's what happens when you do what you did this morning in a room full of people who didn't expect it. You don't get to just be a good shooter after that. Become evidence. Evidence of what? That the assessment was wrong. That the system that produced the assessment has a flaw. The flaw produces costs. He set his coffee cup down. You can resist being used as evidence. That's your right. But the evidence exists regardless. She reassembled the barrel, attached it to the action, ran a function check bolt throw, trigger break, safety engagement, all of it moving through its sequence with the specific, well-maintained precision of a weapon that had been cared for over decades by people who understood what they were caring for. "What did you do with the field log?" she asked. "After my father's last entry." "Before today. I kept writing in it," Voss said. "Page 89 and forward. 15 months of entries since the last one in his hand." He paused. "I'm going to show you those too, but not today." "Why not today?" "Because today you need to sit with page 88, he said. "If I give you 89 through the end on the same day, you'll read them with your head full of this morning and the debrief and Holloway and all of it. You'll miss things." She looked at him. "You're doing what he did." "What's that?" "Controlling the sequence. Making sure I absorb the lesson before you give me the next one." Voss smiled, the same almost smile she'd seen the previous afternoon. "He taught me that too," he said. "We spent 20 years, each teaching the other things without realizing we were doing it." She locked the rifle's components into final position and set it on the cleaning table with the action open to air. Outside, a vehicle had pulled up to the operations building. She could hear the engine, the doors, voices she didn't recognize. New personnel arriving, or the sensitive site exploitation team, returning with materiel from the compound. The base absorbed arrivals and departures the way all operating bases did, without ceremony, each new input folding into the ongoing machinery. "There's something else," Voss said. His tone had changed slightly, not heavier exactly, but more deliberate. The shift that happened when someone was approaching a thing they'd been approaching carefully. "All right," she said. "After the formal debrief this morning, Holloway spoke with me privately. He's submitting a formal recommendation to Theater Command." "For what?" "Requesting that you be made available for a follow-on role with the task force. Not permanently. A temporary assignment, 60 to 90 days. He paused. "As a precision fires asset with specialized engagement authority." She looked at him. "That's a SOCOM billet. It's a temporary attachment. Holloway has the authority to request it through theater. Whether your chain of command approves the release is a separate question. My commanding officer is a major who has never deployed to Afghanistan and whose primary exposure to your work has been quarterly range qualifications," Voss said. He said it without judgment, as a simple statement of institutional reality. The approval would come from above his level. Theater Command has the general's interest. The general's interest carries weight. She sat with that. The rifle on the table in front of her. The morning's work somewhere behind her in the mountain valley. The notebook in her jacket pocket with her name on page 88. "I'm a staff sergeant," she said. "Yes. A temporary task force attachment at this level is irregular," Voss said. "Holloway knows that. He made the recommendation anyway." He paused. "He told me that the engagement this morning represented a capability that the task force does not have organically. That losing that capability back to a standard unit assignment represents a cost he's not willing to accept without at least making the request." She turned this over. The practical realities, her unit at Fort Carson, the training calendar, the soldiers she worked with. The institutional mechanisms involved in a temporary attachment of this kind. Paperwork, the approvals, the specific friction that the military applied to anything that didn't fit its standard categories. And on the other side, the compound on the far ridgeline. Field log in her pocket, the 60 to 90 days that Holloway was asking for. "You knew about this before you came out here," she said to Voss. He didn't look away. "I was asked my assessment of the feasibility before Holloway made the recommendation." "What was your assessment?" "That the engagement capability exists and that it would be wasted returning to a standard assignment without a formal recognition of what it represents and what it can do." He paused. I also assessed that you might not want to do it. Why? Because you've been working inside a system that has systematically underestimated you for 9 years. And the offer of a temporary high-visibility attachment from the people who were doing the underestimating 24 hours ago might feel less like an opportunity and more like an adjustment, she said, yes, as opposed to a policy change. Yes. She looked at the rifle, at the notebook's edge, visible at her jacket breast pocket. The middle distance of the Afghan afternoon. At the middle distance of the afternoon, which was nothing remarkable, just being an afternoon. Oh, cold and clear, and completely indifferent to the conversation happening in front of it. It's both, she said finally. It can be both. That's true. An adjustment and a policy change aren't mutually exclusive. The adjustment is real. The opportunity is also real. She paused. I'm not going to refuse a real opportunity because the people offering it should have seen sooner. Voss nodded, not as though he'd expected a different answer more, as though he'd needed to hear her reach it on her own rather than be led there. Good, he said. I want something in return. What? I want Holloway to put the engagement methodology in writing, not the operational debrief that exists already. I mean the assessment methodology. What criteria were used to evaluate the previous shooters? What variables were considered? What was not considered? She paused. If the assessment process has a structural flaw that produces this kind of miss, that flaw should be documented and corrected. Not anecdotally, formally. Voss looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant ask. I know. You're essentially asking Holloway to formally document that his intake assessment methodology is flawed. I'm asking him to document that the methodology produced a near miss on a viable operational asset and that it should be reviewed. She paused. There's a difference between documenting failure and documenting the need for a review. One is an admission. The other is professional development. Voss was quiet. Outside, the vehicle she'd heard had moved. The engine sound was gone, replaced by the base's normal ambient noise. Somewhere, a radio was transmitting traffic in Pashto, the interpreter's voice filtering it into English in a low parallel stream. I'll pass the request to Holloway, Voss said. Tell him it's not a condition of the attachment, she said. I'll accept the attachment regardless, but it's a request I'm making formally, and I'd like a formal response. Tell him. She picked up the rifle and returned it to the case. Each component in its place, the foam holding the weapon's weight, latch clicking closed with the finality of something secured. Voss, she said, yes. My father's entry. Page 88. She kept her hands on the latched case. He said you'd know when the time was right. Yes. This morning, you gave me the notebook before the shot. Before the debrief, before any of this. She looked at him. That wasn't after the time was right. That was before it. Voss picked up his coffee cup. Empty, he'd finished it long ago, but the gesture of holding it remained. I gave it to you when you needed it most, he said. Not after everything was resolved. Before. He paused. Time being right doesn't mean everything has worked out. Sometimes it means you're about to need something to hold on to. Stood with that. He knew you'd interpret it differently than he intended, she said. He knew you'd time it your own way. Robert knew I'd do what I thought was correct, Voss said. That's why he trusted me with it. He set the empty cup down on the table. He knew that I knew you better than he thought he'd told me. Because he'd talked about you more than he realized. Over 20 years of working together, in short, infrequent bursts, he talked about you constantly. Without noticing that he was doing it. The afternoon was moving toward its end. The light on the ridgelines was changing, the shadows beginning their long creep across the valley floor. She latched the rifle case, picked it up, felt the weight of it in her hand, familiar specific, the weight of everything it had ever carried and everything it was going to carry still. Let's go find Holloway, she said. Voss stood. Yes. He buttoned his jacket against the cold that was already starting to come down off the ridgeline. Let's. They walked back into the base together, the old spotter and the marksman who carried the rifle of the man who had connected them, and the afternoon closed behind them like a door shutting on the day's first chapter and opening, without pause, onto whatever came after. Holloway was in the operations center when they found him, standing at the main map table with a secure phone against his ear and a pen in his hand that he wasn't using. He looked up when they came in, held up one finger without breaking his phone conversation, and finished the call in under a minute with the clipped efficiency of someone who had learned to conduct complex institutional business in shortest possible time. He set the phone down, looked at both of them. "I was going to come find you," he said. "We saved you the walk, sir," Voss said. Holloway's eyes moved to Mara. He read something in her posture, not the specific content of what she was going to say, but the quality of it, the fact that she had come here with something decided rather than something being offered. His expression settled into the attentive neutrality of someone prepared to receive information. "The attachment request," Mara said. "I'll accept it, pending my chain of command's approval." Holloway nodded once. "I'll make the call to your brigade commander this evening. Theater has already flagged the request upward. I have a condition." His expression didn't change. "Go ahead. Not a condition on the attachment. A separate formal request." She kept her voice level, the same tone she used in debriefs, not aggressive, not deferential, just accurate. "I'm requesting that the task force conduct a formal review of its precision fires assessment methodology. Specifically, the criteria used to evaluate shooter candidates for non-standard engagement profiles." Beat of silence. Haverford, who had been working at a side station, had stopped moving. "You're asking me to document that my assessment process missed you," Holloway said. "I'm asking you to document that the assessment process produced an incomplete picture of available capability," she said, "which caused a 48-hour delay in mission execution and required an outside referral to resolve. That's a process observation, not a personal one." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss, who gave him nothing, just stood there, arms at his sides, expression completely neutral, the specific absence of expression that meant this is between the two of you. "If I submit that review request formally," Holloway said, "it becomes part of the task force's operational record. Gets read at theater level, possibly above." "Yes," Mara said. "It's not a small thing." "No, sir, it isn't." Another silence. This one longer. Holloway set his pen down on the map table and took 3 steps to the window, a narrow, reinforced opening that looked out over the base's south perimeter toward the valley. He stood there with his hands behind his back for a moment, looking at nothing visible. 31 years, he said, without turning around. "I've submitted performance reviews, after-action reports, operational assessments, budget justifications, strategic recommendations. Some of them changed things. Most of them went into files and stayed there." He turned back. "A formal methodology review request from a task force commander carries more institutional weight than the same request from a junior officer or an inspector general finding. It requires a response, not a filing." "Yes, sir," Mara said. "You know this." "I do. You could have negotiated for something more immediately tangible. Promotion recommendation, a commendation citation, an expedited assignment." He studied her. "You're asking for something structural instead." "The tangible things benefit me," she said. "The structural thing benefits the next person." Holloway held her gaze. Whatever was moving behind his eyes was complex enough that it didn't resolve into a single readable expression. It was several things at once, and she gave him the space to have all of them. Then he picked up the pen, pulled a notepad toward him, wrote 3 lines, set the pen down and looked at what he'd written. "I'll submit the review request with the after-action documentation," he said. "I'll include the specific engagement sequence as the primary case study, with your name, rank, and engagement parameters on record." He paused. That means your name is attached to a document that demonstrates a task force level methodology failure. That may not be comfortable for your career in certain contexts. My career has not been comfortable in most contexts, sir, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. No, I don't imagine it has. He set the notepad aside. Done. The request goes in with the formal package. He looked at Voss. Elias, I want you to co-sign it. Your operational history gives it additional weight. Agreed, Voss said. All right. Holloway straightened. The specific posture shift that meant a decision had been made, and they were moving past it into implementation. Transport is at 1,400 tomorrow. You'll stage at Bagram for 24 hours while the attachment paperwork processes. Then you'll have 72 hours at Carson before you're officially on detachment status. He looked at Mara. Bring what you need for 60 days in theater. We operate light, but we operate continuously. Understood, sir, and Sergeant. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a challenge coin, not the titanium task force coin that Haverford had given her, but something different. Older. The metal was worn and the emblem on it was a design she didn't recognize, institutional but not standard. This belonged to the previous task force commander. He gave it to me when he rotated out. He told me to give it to the next person who genuinely surprised him. He set it on the map table between them. I've had it for 3 years. She looked at it, then at him. I'm not giving it to you as a commendation, he said. I'm giving it because it needs to go to the right person, and I'm clear now on who that is. He paused. Pick it up. She picked it up. The transport left at 1,358 hours. 2 minutes early, which was either an anomaly or a statement about the pilot's relationship with schedules. Mara sat in the same cargo bay position she'd occupied on the inbound flight, rifle case between her boots, the same orientation, the same cold altitude light coming through the small porthole above her. Different weight in the pack, though. Voss's field notebook. Both coins. The printed copy of the formal review request that Holloway had given her before she boarded, not the final submission, which would go through channels, but a working copy with his signature already on it, and a space on the second page, where Voss had added his name that morning in the same compressed handwriting she'd seen in the notebook's margins. Voss was not on the transport. He'd said his goodbye at the aircraft pad, brief and without ceremony, which was the correct way. The notebook, she'd said. It's yours, he'd said. Don't lose it. I won't. Page 89 is a wind chart for a position in Helmand I never got to use. He'd paused. Maybe you will. She'd held out her hand. He'd looked at it for a moment, then shook it, and then, unexpectedly, put his other hand over the handshake for a moment. Not long. A second. The kind of gesture that people made when they knew they might not see each other again and didn't want to dramatize it, but couldn't let it pass unmarked. You did well, he'd said. Both of you. She'd understood the second part without asking. Now, in the cargo bay, she opened the notebook to page 89. The wind chart was exactly as described, a detailed rendering of a Helmand Valley position, wind patterns at multiple distance bands, elevation gradients, vegetation notes. Below it, in smaller script, position never used. Target was taken by a different route before engagement was necessary. Recorded here for completeness. Knowledge that goes unwritten goes unremembered. Below that, a single additional line. RC would have appreciated this valley. The light is good in the morning. She ran her thumb across the line. The pen impression of her father's handwriting transferred to paper years before she'd held this notebook. Still legible, still present. She closed the notebook and looked at the porthole. Below the aircraft, Afghanistan was making its slow way past the fractured terrain, the ridgelines that looked from altitude like something that had been broken and never quite reassembled. The brown and gray and occasional dark green of a landscape that had been the setting of conflict for so long that the conflict had become part of its topography. She was going back to it in 72 hours with a different assignment, a different status, and the specific institutional visibility that came with being the name attached to a formal methodology review, requested by a task force admiral. That visibility would produce some things that would be useful and some things that would be uncomfortable, and she had made the decision with both of those outcomes in mind. The aircraft banked south. She leaned her head back against the cargo bay wall and, for the first time in 36 hours, let herself be entirely still. Fort Carson in November was cold in a different way than Afghanistan lower elevation, less dramatic, the cold domestic and persistent, rather than sharp and absolute. She had 71 hours before she needed to report for the detachment staging process, and she used the first 4 of them to sleep, the next 2 to eat actual food at a restaurant off-post that had been there since she was a private, and the remainder to deal with the administrative realities of a temporary special assignment, personal gear audit, weapons accountability, a conversation with her platoon sergeant that was professional and brief and slightly awkward because Sergeant First Class Donaldson had received a notification from brigade before she'd come through the gate and didn't know exactly what to do with the information it contained. Task force attachment, Donaldson said, looking at the notification on his screen. Direct request from theater, admiral level. He looked up at her. You want to tell me what happened over there? A shot needed to be made, she said. I made it. He looked at her for a long moment. Donaldson was a good NCO, not spectacular, but solid, the kind of sergeant first class who kept things running correctly and didn't manufacture drama. He'd worked with her for 2 years. He'd always treated her fairly, which was not the same as treating her without bias, but it was something. How long were you over there? He said. 36 hours. 36 hours. He looked back at the screen, and this came out of 36 hours. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you need anything before you stage? No, Sergeant. I'm good. All right. He turned back to his screen. For what it's worth, he stopped. Started again. I always knew you were good. I want you to know I knew that. She looked at him. He was not meeting her eyes, which told her everything she needed to know about the specific discomfort of that statement, the gap between knowing someone was good and what he'd actually done with that knowledge over 2 years. I know you did, she said. She said kindly, because it was the true response, and because unkindness would have been easy and useless. Care of the platoon. Always, he said. She walked out of the office into the Carson afternoon, which was doing its flat November thing, pale sky, bare trees at the perimeter, the specific quality of light that military installations had in the off-season, neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, simply present. She had 68 hours left. She spent part of it on the range. Not because she needed range time, her firing position had been confirmed at a level that didn't require practice, but because the range was where she thought most clearly, and she had things to think about. She ran the rifle at 800 meters. Not pushing the distance, just working, the repetitive discipline of position establishment. Breathing. Trigger control, the fundamental sequence that everything else was built on. The downrange targets came back with groups that would have satisfied most competition shooters. She noted them, logged them, and kept shooting. On the 4th relay, a specialist from another unit appeared at the adjacent firing point, set up her own equipment, and began working through what was clearly a remedial practice. Sequence groups that were scattered, inconsistent. Pattern of someone who hadn't found their trigger management yet. She was young, early 20s probably. She was clearly frustrated, her jaw set in the specific way of someone trying harder instead of differently. Mara finished her relay, cleared and safed her rifle, watched the specialist run another string and produce the same scattered result. Hey, she said. The specialist looked over, clocked her rank. Sergeant, what distance? 300. What's your group looking like? Specialist hesitated. Not great. Can I look? Another hesitation. Then, yeah, sure. Mara walked to the neighboring point and looked at the target the specialist was running. The group wasn't scattered randomly. It had a pattern. High right on the vertical plane, with a slight left drift on the horizontal. Consistent, which meant it was correctable. Your trigger finger placement, Mara said. Where are you making contact with the trigger? First joint, the specialist said. Move it to the pad, the fleshy part between the first joint and the tip. She demonstrated with her own hand, holding it up so the specialist could see the position. When you're using the first joint, you're pulling slightly to the right as you press, because your finger has to travel around the curve of the trigger. Pad contact keeps the press direction straight. The specialist looked at her hand, then at her own. That's it? Try it. The specialist settled back into position, ran 3 shots, came back up and looked at the target downrange. The group had tightened. Still not excellent, 3 rounds was a small sample, but the high right bias was substantially reduced. She turned to Mara with an expression that was partway between surprise and something more complicated. How did you see that from over there? I wasn't watching from over there. Came over here and looked at your group. Mara paused. The group tells you what the body is doing. Most of the time, the problem is something specific and correctable. It's rarely that someone just can't shoot. The specialist looked at her. Were you on the advanced marksmanship cadre? No. I'm just someone who spent a lot of time at this. What unit are you with? Right now? It's complicated. Mara looked at the specialist's setup, the rifle, the position, the way she'd arranged her equipment on the firing mat. How long have you been having this problem? Since my last qualification. I passed, but barely. My sergeant told me to come out and practice. A pause. He didn't tell me what to practice. Mara looked at the range officer's booth. They had time on the line for at least another hour. Run another relay, she said. Use the pad contact. For every 5-round string, stop and tell me what you felt on the trigger brake. Not what the target looked like what you felt. The specialist blinked. You're going to stay? I've got time, Marissa said. She went back to her firing point, ran her own next relay. In the adjacent point, she could hear the specialist working the measured pace of someone paying attention to something different than they'd been paying attention to before. After the relay, the specialist described the trigger brake in terms that showed she'd actually felt something, could articulate it, was beginning to understand her own mechanics from the inside, rather than just correcting for the external symptom. They worked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, the specialists' groups had gone from scattered high right to a tight, consistent center of mass pattern at 300 meters that would have passed any qualification standard with room to spare. Specialist stared at the final target for a long moment. The best group I've ever shot. That's because you were doing it right, Mara said. Capability was there. The technique just needed to catch up. Specialist turned to her. Can I ask your name, Sergeant? Calloway. Calloway. She seemed to search for recognition. Didn't find it, which made sense. The operational security around what had happened at Iron Ridge meant the specifics were not going to be appearing in Fort Carson's break room conversation any time soon. Thank you. Seriously, practice the pad contact until it's automatic, Mara said. Once it's automatic, you'll stop thinking about it, which means your attention can go somewhere more useful. Specialist nodded, began breaking down her equipment. Then she looked up once more. Do you teach? Like, formally? Not yet, Mara said. She heard herself say it, not no. Not I'm a shooter. Not an instructor, but not yet. The answer surprised her slightly. Why? Because you should, the specialist said simply. The way you explained that I've had 2 years of people telling me to work on my trigger, and nobody ever said it like that. Nobody ever made me understand what I was supposed to feel. She went back to her equipment. Mara looked at the range, the downrange targets, the cold afternoon sky beyond them. Not yet. The 72 hours passed the way transition periods always did, faster than the time before them and slower than the time after. She packed her detachment gear with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done it enough times to know exactly what she needed and what she didn't, which was a different and harder skill than it sounded. You learned what to leave behind through a series of lessons, each one costing something. She left some things, took others. The rifle came. The notebook came. Both coins. The night before she staged, she sat at the desk in her barracks room and opened the field notebook to the back pages, the ones in Voss's hand, written in the 16 months since her father's last entry. She'd been rationing them, reading a few pages at a time, the way you rationed anything that was both valuable and finite. The entries were precise and operational wind charts, range data, equipment notes, the accumulated meteorological observations of an old spotter who had never stopped working even when there was no immediate job to work them for. Interspersed with the technical material were other things. Notes on specific shots he'd witnessed, observations on teaching and knowledge transfer, passage about a shooter he'd worked with in 2019 who had reminded him of Mara Calloway and what that similarity had meant to him. And on page 112, a short entry with no operational context, just a date and a paragraph. March, no job this month. Spent the week going back through the early sections of this log. 40 years of field data, and the most useful thing in it is not the wind charts, or the ballistics, or the range notes. The places where I wrote down what someone else taught me. Twice in my career, someone taught me something that changed how I saw the whole problem. Robert was one of those. The question I keep returning to is not what he taught me, but what I did with it, whether I passed it on correctly, to the right people at the right time. I don't have a clean answer. I have this log. I have the hope that the log finds someone who can use it. Closed the notebook. The hope that the log finds someone who can use it. It had. She thought about the specialist on the range. The 40 minutes of working through a trigger problem that 2 years of vague instruction had not resolved. The group on the final target. The expression on the specialist's face, not gratitude. Exactly. Something more specific. The look of someone who had just understood something from the inside and recognized that the understanding was theirs to keep. She thought about her father on the back 40 in Wyoming, setting her behind a spotting scope for 4 hours of wind reading before he ever put a rifle in her hands. About the patience of that method, the understanding that the foundation had to exist before the structure could go on it. She thought about what she'd told Donaldson. A shot needed to be made. I made it. True, and also the smallest version of what had happened. The shot had been made by a person who had been built over 31 years by a man who had been taught by other people who had each been built by others before them. Chain of accumulated knowledge stretching back far enough that its origin was theoretical rather than traceable. She was not the origin of what she'd done at Iron Ridge. She was the current point, the place where everything that had come before arrived and expressed itself and moved forward, which meant the forward part was her responsibility now. Not as obligation, as inheritance. The staging process took most of the morning gear check, weapons accountability, a briefing on the theater situation that had evolved slightly since she'd left Iron Ridge 3 days ago. The detained operations coordinator had provided information under interrogation that had generated 3 follow-on targeting packages. 2 of the 3 were in active mission development. The task force was moving. She was going back into something that was already in motion, which was how it usually worked. Conflicts didn't pause for personnel transitions. At the staging bay, waiting for the transport call, she found herself sitting across from another soldier who was heading back into theater after leave, a young sergeant, one infantry, who had the specific distant quality of someone transitioning from one context to another and not quite in either one yet. He was looking at his phone. Then he wasn't. Then he looked at her rifle case. "That's old," he said. "What caliber?" 0.338 Lapua. He nodded. Long range? Very. He looked at her rank. The case. You a sniper? She thought about how to answer that. It was a simple question, and it had a complicated answer. Not because the answer itself was complicated, but because the word sniper carried specific institutional definitions that didn't quite contain everything the question was reaching for. I'm a precision shooter, she said, currently assigned as a fire's asset to a special operations task force. He raised his eyebrows slightly. That's not a standard billet for a staff sergeant. No, she agreed. It isn't. He went back to his phone. Then, after a moment, what made them pick you? She thought about Holloway's face when she'd walked into his command room. About 3 previous assessment reports declaring the shot non-viable. About a field notebook with her name on page 88. They needed a shot made, she said. I've been preparing for that shot my entire life, even when I didn't know it was that specific shot. He looked at her. How do you prepare for a shot you don't know about? You prepare for all of them, she said. You don't get to pick which one matters. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted not dramatically, not a movie moment, just the small visible movement of an idea landing somewhere it would stay. Yeah, he said quietly. Okay. The transport call came over the PA. She stood, picked up the rifle case, felt the weight of it settle into her grip exactly as it always had, familiar, specific, the weight of 2 generations of accumulated work and the beginning of a third. She walked toward the staging door and the aircraft beyond it and the world she was returning to. The 60-day attachment became 90. The 90 became a formal secondary assignment. The formal secondary assignment, 18 months later, became a permanent transfer with the promotion that had been in the pipeline since the general had made a phone call that was technically a courtesy and actually a directive. Sergeant First Class Mara Calloway. The promotion board had been 6 people in a room at Pentagon level, and she'd sat in front of them with her record in their hands and answered their questions with the same levelness she brought to everything. One of them had asked her about the Iron Ridge engagement. She'd given them the technical parameters, the range, the conditions, the sequence. He'd asked what she'd been thinking in the moment before the primary shot. I was thinking about wind, she said. He'd looked at her. Nothing else? Wind was the problem, she said. I was thinking about the problem. The promotion board's recommendation had been unanimous. The formal methodology review that Holloway had submitted had taken 14 months to generate an institutional response, which was fast by the standards of military process review. The response was a revised assessment framework for precision fires candidate evaluation. At the special operations level, a 9-page document that expanded the criteria beyond performance record and engagement history to include specific high-value target engagement parameters, spotter compatibility assessment, and in language that was carefully institutional but unmistakably direct, the explicit removal of any factors unrelated to demonstrated technical capability from the candidate evaluation process. It didn't fix everything. It fixed something, which was more than nothing, which was more than what had existed before. Hefford sent her a copy with a handwritten note attached, page 7, paragraph 3. It's yours. She read page 7, paragraph 3. It addressed the specific assessment gap that had produced the 48-hour delay at Iron Ridge, the failure to account for capability that fell outside expected candidate profiles. The language was dry and bureaucratic, the way policy language always was, but inside the dry language was a direct acknowledgement that the gap had existed, that it had produced a near mission failure, and that it would not be permitted to persist. She filed the document and the note in the same folder as the field notebook's copied pages, which she'd begun keeping in a separate organizational system, the original notebook too valuable to risk in field conditions. Working copy made and annotated by her over the 18 months of the attachment. The working copy was filling up, her handwriting in the margins, alongside Voss's and her father's. Third generation of additions to a document that had started 40-some years ago, with a retired colonel writing "wind" out of the west, variable at the top of a field page in Helmand Province. Knowledge that goes unwritten, goes unremembered. She was writing it down. Voss died in March, 2 years after Iron Ridge. Not dramatically, he went, the way old men went when they'd used their bodies completely and had no particular interest in what came after the using was done. His daughter called Mara because he'd left a note asking her to. The note said, "Tell Calloway she can have the rest of the log pages. She knows what to do with them." She attended the funeral. Small, appropriate. The kind of service a man like Voss would have approved of, direct and honest, and without unnecessary length. His daughter gave her a box of personal effects, as requested. Inside the box, under a folded dress uniform, was the original field log for the years she didn't have, the 40 years before the Helmand section she already possessed. She sat in her vehicle in the parking lot of the funeral home and opened the box and looked at that log, then closed it again and held it in her hands for a long time. Then she drove back to base and went to work. Specialist Nina Hart came to her 6 months after Voss died, by way of a referral from a marksmanship instructor at Fort Bragg, who had written in his referral note that he'd never seen a more frustrating combination of raw capability and technical deficiency in 20 years of instruction, and that he believed the deficiency was the right person worked on it. Hart was 23, from rural Kentucky, with hands that already had the specific steadiness of someone who'd grown up around guns, and eyes that cataloged distance in a way most people's didn't. Her formal shooting record was mediocre, which the Marmot's instructor had explained was because she overthought the fundamentals in ways that disrupted mechanics she was otherwise capable of. Mara watched her shoot for 20 minutes and saw immediately what the instructor meant. The capability was there. The noise on top of it was fixable. "Stop," she said. Hart lowered the rifle. "You're solving the wrong problem," Mara said. "You're thinking about where the bullet goes. Think about what your body is doing." Hart looked at her. "Isn't the point the bullet? The bullet goes where the body sends it. The body is the problem you can control. The bullet is the result." A beat of silence. "My instructor at Bragg said the same thing a different way, and I didn't get it." "What's different about the way I said it?" Hart was quiet for a moment. "The way you said it, the body is something I can fix. The way he said it, the bullet was something I was failing at." Mara looked at her for a moment. "Pick up the rifle." Hart shot the next relay with groups that were 30% tighter than anything in her record. Not because Mara had given her a technical correction, because she'd moved the problem to a place where Hart could reach it. They worked together for 2 months, then 6, then in the irregular and sustained way that teaching and learning worked when both parties were serious about it, not scheduled, not formal, but continuous. Hart asked good questions. Mara answered them directly and admitted when she didn't have an answer, which was not often, but was not never. "How do you know when you're ready for a real shot?" Hart asked one afternoon. After a session at distance that had produced results, neither of them had expected to see this early. "You don't know before it," Mara said. "You know after. Preparation is what you control. The readiness reveals itself. How long did it take you to be ready for the shot I'm known for?" She thought about Iron Ridge, about everything that had preceded it. 31 years. Hart looked at her. "That's not a useful answer." "No, it's the true answer." Mara paused. "The useful version is, you're ready when you've prepared everything that can be prepared and you've made peace with everything that can't. The rest is execution. And if the execution fails, then you have examined the failure accurately and you correct it." She picked up her own rifle. "The failure is not the problem. Misreading the failure is the problem." Hart nodded slowly, the specific nod of someone filing something. She'd been filing things for 6 months, and Mara had been watching what she did, with what she filed, how she integrated it, what she built from it, whether the knowledge was moving from received to applied. It was moving, steadily, imperfectly, in the way that actual learning always moved. Mara thought about what Voss had written on page 112. The most useful thing in 40 years of notes is the places where I wrote down what someone else taught me. She opened her working copy of the log after that session and added a new entry, Heart. Distance work, 6 months. Application consistent with underlying capability. Trigger management resolved. Breathing's cycle requires further work, but foundation is there. Teach the body before the bullet. She'll be ready before she knows she is. She paused. Added one more line. RC would have seen it in the first session. I needed 6 months. That's the difference between his eye and mine, and also the difference between how we each learned. He was faster. I'm more thorough. Both have uses. She closed the log. The rifle stayed beside her for the rest of her career. Picked up additional wear, a new scratch on the stock, from a position she'd held too long on a rock surface in a country she couldn't name in this record. A re-bluing of the barrel that had been necessary after a deployment's worth of salt and humidity had begun to work on the metal. The walnut aged. The initials her father had stamped above the trigger guard deepened slightly with the oil of years of handling. It had been her father's for 22 years. It had been hers for 15 and counting. She could no longer tell, on most days, which of them was carrying the other. Nina Hart qualified as a designated marksman 2 years after their first session. At her qualification, she produced a group at 800 meters that was within the top 5 percentile of recorded qualification scores at that range for her weapon system. The range officer looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Afterward, Hart found Mara and said, "Without preamble, I want to learn what you know." "You're learning it," Mara said. "All of it. The whole thing." "That's not a request you complete," Mara said. "That's a direction you move in." Hart looked at her. "Then I want to move in that direction." "You already are," Mara said. "You have been for 2 years." Hart was quiet for a moment. "Then, will you give me the log? When you're done with it?" Mara looked at her. The question was more serious than it sounded. Hart was asking something larger than she'd framed it. She was asking whether the chain continued. Whether what had been passed to Mara from Voss, from her father, was going to stop with her or move forward. "When you're ready for it," Mara said. "How will I know?" "You'll make a shot that requires everything you have," Mara said. "And afterward, you'll understand what you're still missing. And when you can name what you're missing accurately, then you're ready for the log." Hart nodded, filed it. The afternoon was doing something uncomplicated with the light, just being light, the ordinary version, falling on the range and the perimeter trees and the downrange targets, and all of it without preference or agenda. Mara picked up her rifle case, felt the weight settle into her grip. Somewhere in a mountain valley in eastern Afghanistan, the compound that had been Karimi's fortress had been repurposed twice since the mission, first as an outpost, then as nothing. Then reclaimed by the landscape in the way that landscape eventually reclaimed everything. The eastern balcony was still there. According to drone imagery she'd been shown in a different briefing context 2 years after Iron Ridge. The railing was rusted now. Nobody stood on it in the morning. The shot had mattered. The shot was done. Everything after it was the part that actually lasted. She walked off the range in the afternoon light, the rifle case in hand, the log in her pack, 23 years of service in her body, and somewhere behind her, a young soldier with steady hands who would one day stand in a room where nobody expected her and understand, only after the fact, exactly how she'd prepared for that moment. Preparation had started decades before the moment. It always did. That is the only thing excellence has ever asked of anyone, not permission, not perfect conditions, not the approval of every room you walk into. Only the willingness to do the work before the world is watching, and to keep doing it long after the world has looked away.